So time for layer 2. This is pretty much dry. I've just put some fresh cloud area in over here, and all I did to achieve that was wait until the first layer was dry, and I took this Graduate 1/2 inch flat brush and I put it into some titanium white, which is on my palette, and then once I loaded the brush, the movement I was using was just literally a diagonal crisscross type of movement, and it doesn't need to look like a realistic cloud. This is just about lively brushwork. So the next thing we need to start working on is the tree, and we can continue working with our flat brushes. If you're feeling more experimental and you're at more of an advanced stage, feel free to use something like a palette knife, various types. Something like this might be good for putting the tree branch in if you wanted to experiment with that. But if you want to stay more on the safe side, or on the side of caution, then we can just stick with our trusty brushes. So I've got some Payne's Grey mixed up here, and I want to start painting this trunk. And again, even this trunk is quite loose, and you'll see that it has some brush marks in it too, so we haven't fully sort of covered the substrate. If your paint's a little bit too dry, then just wet it again. So we want to block in the shape of the tree here, so we've kind of got some semblance of branch over here. It's very loose, it's not kind of as we would normally do a tree. This is very much a kind of playful experimental piece. So I'll get an edge on my tree trunk. Not being very loose here, am I? I'm being quite precious and quite tight. Never mind. Do as I say, not as I do. So we're going to put the branches in up here, and we're just going to kind of give a semblance of those. We're not going to really kind of put a lot of detail into that. We're just going to make some marks, and then I'm going to see how much of this green paint is still active on my palette. Not a huge amount, it would seem. So I'm making a bit of a kind of mix here of a very dark green. So I've got this sap green again and some of the Payne's Grey, and I'm going to start to kind of block in some of those values down here. And again, we've got that kind of other colour going on. I've even picked up some blue, which is quite nice too, so not worried about that too much. And this kind of comes right the way down here, almost connects into this area so it becomes one. We've got some of this light colour here too. Let's plop some of that in. Some of this colour down here. And again, very kind of playfully just mixing, not worrying too much about picking up different colours. Normally we would worry, but today we're having fun, so we're not going to worry about that. Not getting too precious today about things. This is a nice fun introduction to acrylic if you've not used it before, because quite often when we paint in a very, not rigid, but sort of a more formal style, and it's nice just to be able to let the brush kind of skip over the paper and not worry too much about what we're creating, and just sort of having fun mixes. I'm just going to lay some of this down in the background. I might cover over some of this, but I'm just going to lay the paint down in here. Just going to use those lively brush strokes and maybe mix in some of this colour as well. So really not worrying about what we're doing too much. We're just creating these almost abstract shapes actually, which is quite nice. And looking at a variety of colours as well. I've got a little bit of blue on my palette, so I'm going to mix a bit of blue in there too. So we can do what we like today. Just going to give my brush a quick clean because I picked up blue and I want to go back into my greens. I'm also going to put some of this leaf green, which is number 355, onto my palette, and I'm also going to put some processed yellow, which is 675, onto the palette as well. And then we can carry on mixing on the palette and mixing on the paper and seeing what comes. And obviously don't forget, if you've picked up blue and you don't like it, just stick some green on top, because yellow on top because yellow and blue make green. So there you go, playing with our colour mixing as well, and it gives you a really nice range of colours that you're working with. You can mix yellow with like a light green, you could mix some darker green in. You can really play with the colours for this piece. You really don't have to worry too much about what you're doing here. It's really good fun to just experiment with colour. And this is where a lot of learning takes place, when you're just not too worried and you're just having fun. And again, we can do dark over light and light over dark and build the contrast of the piece. You can experiment with different brush strokes. You can change your brush if you wish. You don't have to make it look exactly like the reference photo. You don't have to make it look exactly like my work. You are absolutely free to do what feels right to you within the context of the things that we're learning in this lesson. Moving around all over the place here. A bit of colour at the top, a bit of colour in the middle. Let's get some more of my favourite green on there. And you can play with thickness and thinness of the paint as well. If you want to lay some really textured areas down, you can. It's entirely up to you. You can also let the branch show through. That's quite a nice touch. Because if you think about things in nature, your eye can see through certain things, or perhaps if you don't like that, you can cover it over, partially or fully. So just have a play, see what comes. I just want to make some kind of semi-transparent dabs as well, which almost gives like an impressionistic type of feel to what you're doing. You don't have to have really heavy coverage. You can also have these areas where there's things happening but they're not really kind of explicit. You can take a step back and just sort of look at your work from a slight distance as well. See whether you like what you see, or see whether you think it needs to be adjusted in some way. Again, it's all about developing your discernment. You might also want to mix on the palette, so I've got some nice blue here and some yellow. I've also got white, so I can always make some lighter different types of tones of green, just to kind of mix things up a bit and perhaps give a hint that there's a different light, because we'll have warm and cool tones in nature. You might want to lay some of that over the top down here. You can also pick up different areas of colour on your brush so that your brush looks like this, and then you can just put these down in your foreground if you want to, make them look a bit like a plant. It just adds texture and it adds contrast and it adds visual interest. You might even want to take a completely different colour down here and make it look as though there's some different plants. So for example, you might want to kind of put some yellow in here to make it look as though there's some yellow flowers or something. And again, you know, you might want to use that sgraffito technique and put some kind of grassy type textures in there. Entirely up to you and your imagination really as to what you want to create. You might want to just do a little hint of that in a couple of places, or you might want to use it as a technique elsewhere on your page. You might want to use some very small marks, just using the very end of the brush. Experiment with that. So say we don't have to completely follow what's in the reference photo. It's just a question of layering and playing really. You might want to almost create some bracken type of plants. You might want to partially cover the trunk. There's lots of different ways. This is a bit like painting when you're a child and just being free to experiment and do what you want to do. You might even want to take your finger and just drag that into the paint and see how that works. This is about getting to know acrylic and what it can do, and getting to know your brushes and how they work. You might not like what you've created. If you don't like what you've created, wash your brush, dry it on some rag, and just cover over. That's fine. You can fully cover or you can partially cover. Entirely up to you. You might want to add some areas of shadow, so go in with your darker value and just add it to your work. It's your scene, so you can make it look how you want it to look. You might want to sort of put really, really thick paint on your brush and almost make like wiggly brush strokes. You might want to have some really, really thick areas and some really, really thin areas. But it's a great way to get to know the medium and just play and not worry too much about the result. Just let the paint do what it wants to do. Great way to learn. You're not worried about the outcome. And in the introduction video, if you've watched that, I talk about teaching in a way that allows you not to be too attached to the outcome, so that you see things in an experimental way and you're in the moment when you're actually creating. You don't worry too much about the outcome. Create these little wiggly textures. Quite nice. If you don't like certain areas, maybe you think they're too dark or too light, just go over the top of them. Try some different brush strokes. You might want to add some splashes of really bold colour in there, or you might want to just mix on the page and see what happens. There's all kinds of things that you can do. You can go back over things. Sometimes you kind of have to know when to stop, because sometimes less is more, sometimes more is more. It's quite nice when you're getting into one of those more is more areas when you're working, you're thinking, oh, that's nice, and I'm adding and it's looking good, and then you kind of reach a point sometimes where you get overkill, and that's when you reach the more is more stage. and you realise that perhaps you should have quit while you were ahead. But without doing those experiments, you don't know. And the joy of acrylic paint is you can always let it dry and paint straight over the top. And that's why I love it, because it's really versatile. And it's nice with these flat brushes as well to just play with the angles of the brush and sort of look at stamping and what your brush can do, and just creating different things going on in your work. Because you can start somewhere and kind of end up somewhere completely different. It's just nice to see what happens. It's quite nice to play with these yellows and blues and greens as well, because green is a difficult colour to work with. Quite often the greens that you kind of get doled out in a kit, whether it's pencils or paint, they're not very true to life, and they often look very artificial. So the more you can develop confidence with mixing your own greens, the better. And the sooner you can do that, the better. And you can even create a colour chart where you mix loads of yellows and blues, and you just basically run a load of experiments to see how they look. And then just write your notes on there. So, you know, for example, if I mix pale olive green with cadmium yellow, it gives me this shade. And if I add more yellow, it looks like this. And if I add more of the pale olive green, it looks like this. Or, you know, I've got a Prussian blue and a lemon yellow. What mixes can I get from that? So you can just sort of play an experiment and see what happens. And just, you know, make your own colour mix charts. So I'd say get to a point where you don't want to add any more. And when you feel like you're going to get to that more is more stage and you're going to ruin it, that's the time to stop. And when you work up close to your work, your eyes kind of get used to what you're creating. So sometimes you just need to take a step back or take a bit of a visual rest from something and then come back. But just make sure that you're not leaving dried out brushes or something similar. That's going to be a bit of a nightmare to come back to. So I think my tree is a bit too small. And I also want to add some more of this colour in. So I want to kind of extend it out with some different colour. And don't forget, you can use those kind of wispy, almost semi-transparent brush marks so that you're creating those kind of, it's like ghost shapes. Because they're not sort of fully formed. I mean, you've got sky showing through, and that's exactly what you would have in real life. You wouldn't necessarily have something which was fully formed. I think my tree is probably looking a bit full bloom and possibly a bit overdone. I probably should have used a few less marks on reflection. I've probably gone to the more is more stage. But it's lively, it's got different brush marks, it's experimental. What I might do is just add a little bit more of the darker value to break up the green. So I go back into my Payne's Grey and kind of create some illusions of some branches in here. And when we see branches, we don't sort of see the whole of the branch. We often see sort of different areas just coming through. So you almost get like quite broken lines. And if I really don't like it, then what I can always do is wait for that to dry and then add more of the sky colour in to just break up these areas of green. And it's just a question of really, you know, using your judgment as to when you think something is done. So just keep going until you're happy, and think about your tree shape that you're creating as well. How does your overall tree shape look? Because I kind of carried on until I'd created a really full tree, which is fine. Doesn't mean it's wrong, it just means that it might not be what you'd originally set out to do, but that's what you've kind of ended up with. So yeah, there's a lot going on there. Might wait for that to dry and then come back and see how I feel.